August 1945. The air on the island was not air at all, but a thick, wet blanket woven from sea salt, rot, and the metallic tang of blood. It clung to the skin, seeped into the lungs, and served as a constant, suffocating reminder of the world's end. For the women of the Kokumin Giyū Sentōtai, the Volunteer Combat Corps, this was the final crucible. They were no longer individuals with names like Chiyo, Hana, or Setsuko. They were a single ragged organism, bound by a shared oath and a collective burning certainty. Their world had been systematically shrunk until it consisted of only two things: the divine will of the emperor and the demonic nature of the approaching enemy, the Kichiku Beihei, the American beasts. Every fiber of their being, every lesson hammered into their minds since childhood, every whispered story from the front lines painted the same horrifying portrait. The Americans were giants, undisciplined and brutish, monsters of gluttony and rage, who would not just kill, but defile. They were the ultimate test of a woman's purity, a purity that could only be preserved in death. Their bodies were starved, wiry frames stretched taut over a core of unyielding ideology. Their last rations of rice had been a thin, watery gruel days ago, but they fed on something else now. A feverish, fatalistic pride. In the small pouches tied to their waists, next to the single precious Type 94 grenade they each carried, was a small, crudely wrapped dose of potassium cyanide. Honor was a fortress, and this was the key to the final gate. A promise to themselves and to their ancestors that their bodies would never become the spoils of a lesser race. They huddled in the shattered remains of a concrete bunker, the jungle reclaiming it vine by vine, listening to the symphony of their own defeat. The rhythmic, thunderous shelling had given way to the sporadic crack of rifle fire, closer now, and the guttural, alien shouts of a language they knew only from propaganda films. Chiyo, her knuckles white as she gripped the cold metal of the grenade, watched the entrance. She saw not a doorway, but a precipice. On the other side lay a violation worse than death. They were ready. They were honed. They were prepared for the monster. The first American to appear in the shattered opening was not the horned demon of their indoctrination. He was a boy, scarcely 20, with a face smudged with dirt and exhaustion, his helmet askew, revealing a shock of sweat-plastered blonde hair. He chewed gum, a slow, rhythmic motion of his jaw that seemed an act of profound, almost insulting normalcy in this charnel house. He did not roar. He did not leer. He simply raised his rifle, his eyes scanning the interior with a weary professionalism that was more unnerving than any show of feral rage. More soldiers appeared behind him, their movements economical, their gazes sweeping, assessing. The women braced, fingers tightening on their final solutions, a collective intake of breath held in the humid air. This was the moment, the prelude to the prophesied horror. They were cornered, outnumbered, and at the mercy of the beast. But the horror they had meticulously prepared their souls to endure never came. If you find this unexplored side of history fascinating, consider subscribing for more stories that challenge the narrative. The capture was a blur of bewildering efficiency. There were no roars of triumph, no savage grunts of lust. The American soldiers moved with a detached, almost bored competence. They were herded out of the bunker not with bayonet points, but with sharp, clipped gestures and a few repeated words in a language that sounded flat and unemotional. Out, move, hands up. The women's hands, calloused from digging trenches and tending to the dying, rose into the oppressive air. They were searched for weapons, a process so clinical it was humiliating in its own right. A soldier, his face impassive, quickly patted down Chiyo's sides and legs, his hands firm but impersonal, his focus solely on identifying threats. He found the grenade, deftly unhooked it from her belt, and tossed it into a pile with others. He never once met her eyes. It was the disarming of a thing, not the conquest of a woman. She had been prepared for a ravenous beast, but was met with the cold indifference of a factory worker on an assembly line. This was the first crack in the foundation of her world. They were marched through the jungle, a column of ghosts in tattered uniforms, flanked by these strangely calm giants. The Americans didn't speak to them, and rarely to each other. They communicated with hand signals, their attention fixed on the surrounding jungle, still alert for pockets of resistance. One of the younger women, Hana, weakened by dysentery, stumbled and fell to her knees in the mud. Chiyo's heart seized. This would be it. The moment of weakness that would trigger the beast's cruelty. One of the guards, a corporal with a thick neck and a sunburned nose, stopped. He looked down at Hana, his expression unreadable. He then unhooked his canteen, sloshed it, and wordlessly offered it to her. Hana stared at the metal flask as if it were a venomous snake. The soldier sighed, a sound of mild impatience, knelt, and poured a small amount of water into his cupped hand, gesturing for her to drink. The act was so contrary to the narrative of hate, so mundane in its charity, that it sent a ripple of confusion through the prisoners. The march ended at a clearing by the beach, a makeshift collection point. Wounded men from their own units were already there, being tended to not by their own medics, but by Americans. The women watched, wide-eyed, as a U.S. Navy corpsman carefully cleaned a shrapnel wound on the leg of a Japanese sergeant who, only hours before, had been trying to kill him. The corpsman worked with a focused intensity, applying sulfa powder and wrapping a clean bandage, his movements gentle and precise. He offered the sergeant a cigarette, which was accepted with a stunned, silent nod. The women were segregated, placed under the shade of a large tarpaulin. They sat in the sand, drawing their knees to their chests, a tight knot of silent, watchful fear. They were waiting. The sun beat down, the waves crashed. The American guards smoked and talked in low tones, occasionally glancing their way, but with no more interest than a farmer checking on his livestock. The initial shock was beginning to curdle into a profound and terrifying suspicion. This had to be a trick, a more sophisticated form of torture, a psychological game designed to break their spirit before the real torment began. Enjoying this deep dive into the human side of conflict? Hit that like button and let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Days bled into a week, and the anticipated brutality remained a ghost. The women were transported by landing craft to a larger, more permanent prisoner of war enclosure on a neighboring island. The camp was an entity of stark geometric order that stood in violent contrast to the chaotic decay of their last days of fighting. It was a city of canvas tents and barbed wire, laid out in a precise grid under the punishing sun. Their new reality was governed by a whistle's shriek and a sergeant's bark, a routine that was rigid, but, to their astonishment, not cruel. They were issued 2 blankets each and a mess kit, items of a quality they hadn't seen in years. The guards were a rotating cast of faces, most of them young, all of them imbued with the same mystifying air of professional detachment. They patrolled the perimeter, manned the watchtowers, and supervised the meal lines, but they did not intrude. They were a wall, impassive and impenetrable, and on the other side of that wall, the women waited for the world to realign with their beliefs. The first true assault on their ideology came not from a weapon, but from a spoon. 3 times a day, they lined up at the camp's field kitchen. The food was an absurdity, an offense to their own experience of soldiering. It was K-rations and, on some days, hot meals scooped from massive steel vats. There was bread, sometimes still warm, canned beef hash that was greasy and rich, coffee thick and bitter and real, and chocolate. Small, dense bars of de-rationed chocolate, a confection so alien, so decadent, it felt like a sin to even touch. Chiyo remembered the last months of the siege, the gnawing hunger, the arguments over a handful of weevily rice, the desperate search for edible roots in the jungle. Her own officers had preached that suffering was a virtue, that to endure deprivation was to forge the soul. Yet here were their captors, dispensing calories with an almost careless abundance. They were not just feeding their prisoners, they were feeding them from the same stock they fed themselves. This wasn't charity, it was logistics. And it spoke of a power so vast, so casually immense, that it could afford to waste such riches on its enemies. The psychological dissonance deepened with each passing day. The American soldiers, their supposed tormentors, were a source of endless, maddening contradiction. The women saw them cleaning their rifles with meticulous care, then using the same hands to play a game of catch. They heard them laughing at jokes, their voices carrying over the wire, then saw them stand in solemn silence as a chaplain led a Sunday service near the command tent. They were not the one-dimensional demons of the propaganda posters. They were complex, moody, often bored. One guard, a lanky private from a place called Ohio, spent hours every day trying to coax a small, stray dog to come to the fence, offering it scraps from his own meal. Another, a stocky sergeant, would sit on an ammo crate for hours, staring at a worn photograph. They were men, just men. And this simple, undeniable fact was more terrifying than any monster, because it meant that everything the women had been taught, everything they had been willing to die for, was built upon a lie. Their minds, trained for suicidal defiance, had no defense against this relentless, systematic display of casual humanity. This channel is dedicated to telling the stories you've never heard before. To support our work, please consider sharing this video with someone who appreciates history. The true battle was now being fought entirely within the confines of their own skulls. The barbed wire that enclosed them was nothing compared to the cage of their collapsing worldview. Every new observation was a fresh assault. Chiyo found herself becoming an anthropologist of her captors, studying their habits with a desperate, obsessive focus. She noted the way they received mail, letters from home, that would be read and reread until the paper was soft as cloth. She saw the casual affection between them, the easy camaraderie of a punched shoulder or a shared cigarette, so different from the rigid, brutal hierarchy of their own army, where a superior's boot was a more common form of communication than a kind word. Their discipline was not born of fear, but of something else, a kind of self-assured competence. They followed orders, but they also questioned them in low murmurs, a casual insubordination that would have earned a Japanese soldier a summary execution. The most profound and constant source of this cognitive dissonance was the very thing they had expected to be its centerpiece: the physical treatment of their bodies. The soldiers did not touch them. The rule was absolute, unspoken, but universally observed. When they were marched to the showers, the guards stood at a distance, their backs often turned. When a medic had to examine one of the sick, it was done with a brisk, clinical efficiency, with another guard or even a senior prisoner present as a witness. The women's bodies, which they had been taught were the final battlefield of their honor, were rendered irrelevant. They were not objects of desire, nor of hatred. They were simply prisoners, human inventory. This complete and total lack of interest was a form of psychological warfare more devastating than any physical abuse. It stripped them of their final, most potent weapon, their own martyrdom. They had been prepared to die to protect their honor from the American beasts, but the beasts refused to even acknowledge that their honor was at stake. This refusal to touch, Chiyo began to realize, was not about morality. It wasn't about the Americans being good. It was about something far more significant. It was a display of power. It was the ultimate expression of the victor's confidence. A man who is secure in his strength does not need to prove it on the weak. A nation that is certain of its victory does not need to debase its captives to feel superior. The Japanese military ethos was built on the idea of power demonstrated through cruelty, of spirit triumphing over flesh. The Americans, it seemed, operated on an entirely different principle. Their power was so absolute, so rooted in a seemingly endless supply of machines, food, and medicine that they had no need for the performative cruelty that had been the bedrock of Chiyo's world. The restraint of her captors was not a sign of weakness or decadence, as propaganda had insisted. It was the most intimidating expression of strength she had ever witnessed. It was the strength of a civilization that did not have to stoop to the level of its enemy. The women had been trained to fight an army of men. They were entirely unprepared to be defeated by a system. What are your thoughts on this psychological aspect of warfare? Share your perspective in the comments section. We read every one. The camp became a warped mirror reflecting back a distorted, horrifying image of their own society. The women began to talk amongst themselves, their hushed whispers in the dead of night, a litany of confusion and dawning shame. Hana, the young girl who had been given water, spoke of the medic who changed her bandages daily. He never spoke, but he was always gentle. His hands, which could surely kill, were used only to heal. Setsuko, who had been a teacher before the war, watched the American engineers use a bulldozer to clear a new section of the camp. She marveled at the machine, a roaring yellow beast that did the work of 100 men in a single hour. She remembered the villagers back home, struggling to build fortifications with hand shovels and woven baskets. "They don't win because their spirit is strong," she whispered one night, her voice trembling. "They win because they have these things. They don't need spirit. They have engines." This constant, overwhelming evidence of the enemy's material superiority began to corrode their faith in the intangible virtues they had held sacred. The Yamato Damashi, the Japanese spirit, was supposed to be able to overcome any material obstacle. It was the spiritual sword against the enemy's steel. But here, in this camp, that sword felt like a child's wooden toy. The Americans had steel, and they also had penicillin. They had radios that could pluck voices from the air. They had aircraft that blotted out the sun. And they had a system that treated its defeated enemies with a level of care that the Japanese Empire rarely afforded its own frontline soldiers. The comparison was a slow-acting poison. Every meal was a reminder of their own army's starvation. Every clean bandage was a rebuke to the memory of their comrades dying of gangrene. Every casual, unmolested night of sleep was a mockery of the honor they had been willing to kill themselves to protect. The humiliation was exquisite. It was a deeper, more profound violation than anything they had feared. To have been brutalized, to have been martyred, would have been a confirmation of their worldview. It would have been a victory in defeat, proof that they were morally and spiritually superior to the barbarian hordes, but to be ignored, to be fed, to be treated with a detached, impersonal humanity. This was to have their entire ideology rendered null and void. It suggested that their fanatical struggle, their sacrifice, their willingness to die, was not a grand epic tragedy, but a foolish, pointless gesture in the face of a power that operated on a plane they couldn't even comprehend. Their enemy was not the leering demon they had been promised. Their enemy was the future. It was a future of mass production, of overwhelming logistics, of a strange, confident humanism that could afford to be merciful because it was so unassailably strong. They were not just prisoners of war. They were artifacts of a bygone age, locked in a museum curated by their conquerors. If this story resonates with you, please help our channel grow by hitting the subscribe button and turning on notifications. The psychological breaking point, when it came, was not a dramatic event. There was no single moment of violent revelation. It was a quiet, insidious erosion, like water wearing away stone. For Chiyo, the shift occurred during a routine medical inspection. A typhus outbreak was feared, and the American medical staff, led by a tired-looking captain, decided to inoculate everyone in the camp, prisoners included. The women were lined up, their sleeves rolled up, their faces a mixture of fear and suspicion. They had heard stories of American doctors using prisoners for grotesque experiments. They watched as the corpsmen moved down the line, their hands quick and practiced, swabbing arms with alcohol and administering the shots from gleaming glass syringes. There was no ceremony, no explanation beyond a few translated words. For sickness, it is good. When it was Chiyo's turn, a young corpsman, the same one she had seen tending to the wounded sergeant on the beach, approached her. He was tall, and his shadow fell over her. She flinched, expecting a rough grab, a moment of pain that would finally confirm her fears. Instead, he simply tapped her arm gently. "Relax," he said, his voice soft. He didn't seem to see her as a Japanese soldier, as the enemy. He saw a patient, an arm that needed a needle. He administered the shot with a quick, almost painless efficiency. And as he pulled the needle out, he placed a small square of cotton on the spot and, for a fraction of a second, his thumb pressed it down. It was the most minimal of touches, entirely clinical and devoid of any intent other than medical necessity. But in that fleeting moment of contact, the last wall of Chiyo's defense crumbled into dust. It was the sheer, unthinking gentleness of the act that broke her. It was a touch without malice, without desire, without anger. It was the touch of a man who was so completely in control, so utterly devoid of fear or hatred for her, that he could perform his duty with a simple professional grace. In that moment, she understood. The Americans' restraint was not a policy dictated from on high. It was the natural byproduct of their culture. They were not beasts feigning civility. They were men from a place where this kind of detached professional humanism was simply normal. They were products of a society that was not forged in the crucible of scarcity and fanaticism, but in an environment of such abundance and security that it could mass produce not only tanks and planes, but also men who could treat their enemies with this kind of unnerving decency. The touch was not a violation, it was an education. It was a lesson in a different kind of power, a power so vast and so self-assured that it had no need for hatred. Her defeat was total. It was not her body that had been conquered, but her soul. The emperor felt very far away. These moments of human connection in the midst of war are often overlooked. Press the like button if you agree that these stories need to be told. The climax of this internal war arrived with the storm. It was a typhoon, a true monster of the Pacific that descended upon the island with a biblical fury. The sky turned a bruised purple-gray, and the wind shrieked like a tortured spirit. Rain came down not in drops, but in solid horizontal sheets that tore at the tents and turned the camp into a churning sea of mud. The flimsy structures that housed the prisoners groaned and buckled. The women huddled together, their old fears replaced by a more primal terror of the storm. The guards, who had seemed so indomitable, were now just small figures battling the elements, their shouts lost in the gale. Nature, it seemed, was the one enemy they could not overwhelm with logistics. And in the heart of the storm, chaos erupted. A massive gust of wind, a physical blow from the heavens, caught the edge of the large tarpaulin that served as the women's primary shelter. With a sound like a cannon shot, the ropes snapped, and the heavy, waterlogged canvas collapsed, driven by the wind's fury. A scream, thin and sharp, was cut short. When the other women scrambled back, they saw that Hana, the youngest of their group, was trapped beneath the twisted wreckage of canvas and splintered support poles. Her leg was bent at an unnatural angle, and she was silent, either unconscious or dead. The other women clawed at the heavy canvas, but the wind fought them, pressing it down like a malevolent hand. They were losing. Panic began to set in, a raw animal fear that transcended nationality and ideology. In that moment of chaos, the Americans reacted. There was no hesitation, no weighing of the value of a prisoner's life against the risk of the storm. The stocky sergeant, the one who was always looking at a photograph, bellowed an order, and 3 guards, including the lanky private from Ohio, plunged into the morass. They fought the wind and the canvas, their faces set in grim determination. They were joined by the young corpsman, who carried his medical bag like a sacred text. He didn't wait for the wreckage to be cleared. He crawled under the flapping canvas, disappearing into the darkness where Hana lay. The other soldiers, using knives and sheer brute force, finally managed to cut and lift the section of the tent that pinned the girl. They pulled her out, her small form limp and pale, and laid her in the mud as the storm raged around them. The corpsman was already at work. He ignored the wind, the rain, the shouts of the other soldiers. His world had shrunk to the broken girl in front of him. Chiyo watched, transfixed, as he cut away the fabric of Hana's trouser leg, his movements swift and sure. He administered a morphine syringe to ease her pain, his hands steady despite the tempest. He splinted the leg with 2 pieces of a broken pole and strips of torn canvas, working with a ferocious, life-saving focus. He was not a soldier. He was not an American. He was a healer, performing his sacred duty in the heart of hell. And as he worked, he spoke to Hana in a low, calming murmur, the words incomprehensible, but the tone universal. It was the sound of help, the sound of hope. Your engagement helps us to create more content like this. Take a moment to comment below with your thoughts or questions. In that tableau, illuminated by the strobing flashes of lightning, Chiyo saw the war's true victor and its true vanquished. It wasn't a matter of armies or nations. It was a clash of 2 fundamental ideas. Her world, the world of Imperial Japan, had taught her that power was the will to die, the will to destroy, the will to endure suffering. It was a philosophy of glorious spiritual negation, but the Americans, they possessed a different and far more potent kind of power. It was the power to create, to build, to organize, to heal. It was the power that manifested in the endless supply of K-rations, the roaring bulldozers, the life-saving penicillin, and now in the hands of a young man saving his enemy's life in the middle of a typhoon. This was not a power you could defeat with spirit, because it was a power that nurtured life instead of celebrating death. The Americans' refusal to touch them, to violate them, was not an act of kindness. Chiyo finally understood it was a symbol. It was the ultimate, almost contemptuous display of their superiority. They didn't need to break the women's bodies because they had already shattered their reality. They didn't need to prove their dominance through rape and pillage because their dominance was self-evident in every can of beef, every roll of bandages, every perfectly functioning engine. To have brutalized them would have been to acknowledge them as equals, as a genuine threat whose spirit needed to be broken. Instead, they had treated them with a professional logistical indifference that was a far more damning verdict. It was a verdict that said, "You are not a spiritual threat. You are not a moral challenger. You are simply the defeated remnants of an outdated ideology, and now you are a problem to be managed." The image of the corpsman shielding Hana's face from the rain with his own body was burned into Chiyo's mind. That single, selfless act was the culmination of everything she had witnessed. It was the symbol of a system that could produce a man like that, a man trained to kill, yet whose first instinct in a crisis was to save. A system so wealthy in resources, so confident in its own values, that it could afford to extend its humanity even to those who had declared themselves its mortal enemies. It was a force as powerful and as indifferent as the typhoon itself. And against that force, their bamboo spears and their suicidal courage had been nothing. The war, Chiyo knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, had been lost long before the first shot was ever fired. It had been lost in the factories, the schools, and the homes of a nation they had fatally underestimated. Their entire world had been a beautiful, brittle, and ultimately hollow cage, and the Americans had not even bothered to smash it. They had simply opened the door and let the truth rush in. This kind of perspective-shifting history is what we're all about. If you agree, consider supporting us by becoming a channel member. When the news of the Emperor's broadcast came, it was almost an anticlimax. The war was over. For the other prisoners, it was a moment of cataclysmic shock, of weeping and disbelief. For Chiyo and the other women of her group, it was merely a confirmation of what they already knew in their souls. Their war had not ended with the Emperor's words. It had ended in a muddy POW camp, in the face of a quiet, overwhelming competence and a humanity they had been taught to deny. When they were finally repatriated, they returned to a homeland that was as psychologically shattered as it was physically ruined. Japan was a nation in shock, grappling with a defeat so total it defied comprehension. And the women found themselves adrift, unable to connect with the narratives taking shape around them. They could not share in the bitterness of the unrepentant militarists because they had seen firsthand that the enemy was not a demon and that Japan's defeat was not a matter of bad luck or betrayal, but of a fundamental systemic inferiority. Nor could they fully embrace the simple black and white pacifism that was beginning to take root because their experience was more complicated than that. They had not been defeated by monsters, but they had been defeated by a military machine of terrifying power. Their respect for the strength of the Americans was too real, too visceral to be dismissed. They carried a private, complex truth that had no place in the public mourning or the political rebuilding of their nation. They were ghosts, haunted not by the horrors of what the Americans had done to them, but by the profound, world-altering shock of what they had not done. This experience became the silent, defining legacy of their lives. In the years that followed, as Japan rose from the ashes to become an economic powerhouse, Chiyo would often see the echoes of that camp. She saw it in the efficiency of the new factories, in the logic of the new infrastructure, in the quiet confidence of the post-war generation. It was as if the very system that had defeated them had been transplanted, adapted, and adopted. The strange, alien power they had first witnessed in their captors was now the engine of their own nation's rebirth. The memory of the soldiers' restraint, their refusal to touch, remained with her always. It was not a memory of war, but of a profound and humbling education. It was the memory of the moment she realized that the greatest power in the world was not the power to destroy, but the power to choose not to. Decades later, an elderly Chiyo sat on a park bench in Tokyo, watching the city's vibrant, peaceful life flow around her. A group of young American tourists walked by, laughing, their faces open and full of an easy confidence she recognized. For a fleeting instant, the face of one of the young men blurred and sharpened into the image of the corpsman in the storm, his expression one of focused, life-saving grace. The memory no longer brought confusion or shame. It brought a strange, quiet sense of clarity. Her nation had not truly lost the war until it had learned the lesson she and the other women had been taught in that camp. The ultimate measure of strength is not how one treats one's friends, but how one treats one's vanquished enemies. The war had ended for her, not with a bomb or a broadcast, but with a simple clinical touch and the profound, deafening silence of an expected brutality that never came. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the complexities of human history. Subscribe for more stories that go beyond the headlines and battle lines.